something like English, for every topic we start, we get success criteria with different grades on it, and we have to highlight the key bits and things we can include in our essay or coursework to get that extra grade.
Exams are creeping up on us now. We're going to try and work out how you're going to be assessed in this thing. Right, you've got a sheet in front of you. It's got the GCSE criteria for C, B, A and A star. Have a read, try and work out which one is which first of all. So where's the B, which one's the A? Which one's the dirty C? Obviously, once you've done this, I want you to try and work out why, because anyone can just write grades next to a sentence. Try and work out why that grade is what you're thinking it is.
See, they don't have anything. They just show understanding, basically understand. And for B,
it's a sustained evidence, it's not just like it's one body.
Right then, which one is the A then? Steph?
Demonstrate an analytical and interpretive skill, explore alternative approaches and interpretations. Consider and evaluate the way meaning is conveyed through language, structure and form.
Good, it is that one. How did you know that was an A? Someone else that isn't Steph? Briley?
Because for the A star it says originality of analysis, and you've been telling us that we need original ideas to get A star.
Excellent, good. So the difference between an A and an A star is that for an A star you really have to try and pin down that originality of analysis. What other differences did you spot between an A and A star?
when I say you have to have like an opinion on it and be enthusiastic about it.
You do, yeah, and we've had this discussion before. Enthusiasm doesn't mean you have to jump up and down and pretend you love the poem. It means that you've got to have an enthusiastic response. Good. Anything else that you spotted? Brilliant.
Uses words like sustained and concise.
Absolutely, yeah. You've got to get straight to the point for a nice start. You've got to know what you're saying and get there as accurately as you can. Good. Hopefully by the end of the lesson, you'll be another step nearer that A star.
If they give a list of, like, say, A star, what you need to do for an A star, what you need to do for a C, you'll make sure you do more A star work than a C, because you know what you're doing. If you don't have that success criteria, then you don't know what you're doing, like what you need to do to get that grade. So
It's slightly disingenuous because some of them aren't an A yet, they're not a miracle class. But by talking only about A and A star, the C's and the B's, you'll find they'll reach further towards an A. So by keep talking about an A star, even those that aren't an A will still make progress.
Okay, so this second class, they're also going to be doing the GCSE examination, but these students are 2 years younger. So they're taking an examination intended for 16-year-olds when they're 14 years old. So they're clearly some kind of express class. And it's German, but we have subtitles.
The reason we use peer assessment at the moment with this Year 9 group is because the students are working towards 3 pieces of coursework. Before I ask the students to redraft, I want them to have a full understanding of the criteria and what the exam board is actually looking for. We're going from a C/B to an A/A star for our coursework is what we're all aiming for. So I thought the best thing to do would be to moderate some coursework. Not yours, but other pieces of coursework that have already gone through the process of GCSE examination, and they've been moderated by a team of teachers. So remember, give your examiner a break and not a breakdown. Thank you. Okay. So, ihr habt 10 Minuten. Ihr müsst jetzt diese 3 Kursarbeitblätter lesen und in wie gut oder schlecht es ist. Okay? Also jetzt auf Englisch, we have communication, range of language and accuracy mark. You will need your coursework descriptor sheets that we used a few weeks ago. It's this sheet that you're going to talk about in 8 minutes.
Hotel wrong. It's got a wide range of vocabulary, but not use grill. You have to try to use big words, okay, but not really. Use it successfully. So that 3 on 4. I would say
Okay, Oscar.
For communication for marks, we gave him between like a 7 and 8 because there's a lot of detail and did lots of descriptions. And so he gave a lot of opinion.
I think it'd be a 7, but it was really good. But it could have been like included a bit more information.
Yeah, it was lacking a little bit of information, but it definitely was a 7, and you're absolutely spot on with that. Oscar, what did you give it for range of language?
5. He was quite strong in the past tense, but he could have used more complex sentences.
Okay, interesting. And you gave it 6 for accuracy?
Yeah, because there's only a few minor mistakes.
Good, right. Okay. Rosie, tell me why you disagreed with Oscar and said that it should have a 6 rather than a 5 for range.
Because they use a large variety of sentence types and vocabulary, and it's like they expand our sentences a lot more.
Yeah, interesting. Christian, talk to me a bit about the work you and Rihanna did.
We did it for communication a 4 because it had quite a fair bit of useful information, just not enough to give it a 5.
Right.
Language range a 4 because again it used a lot, but just not enough. And for language accuracy, we gave it a 4 as well, because although we used quite a lot of different words, not all of them were spelt right or were used in the right context.
Who agrees that that piece of coursework was not worthy of a C?
Like all the stuff, it wasn't like explained like in detail.
Detail, that's the key word, isn't it? Detail. If there's no detail, you can't get anything above a C. Now we need to consider any feedback that we could give this student. What feedback could we give this student? David, tell me please.
Widen his range of sentences a bit more.
Okay, well you're really on the right lines there. Well done. Zoe.
Use more opinions and a wide range of opinions because use the same ones.
Good. Really important what Zoe was saying. Just bouncing off Zoe there, what she was saying about opinions. Opinions are really, really important. From the lesson, they have a clear understanding of what it is the exam board is looking for. They now know the marking criteria. They were given student-friendly assessment criteria grids as well. I did change it slightly because sometimes the exam board language isn't that student-friendly. So from that point of view, they now know what to expect in a piece of coursework. They also had a chance to talk to their peers. They got ideas, they exchanged ideas on what they could include in their coursework drafts. And all in all, they demonstrated to me that they can develop the coursework and take it forward so that they're gaining not just C or D grades, but they're looking at A's and A stars.
Okay, so just discuss around your table any similarities and differences between those two video clips. What was similar, what was different? Right, just one point there. Although we saw that the first teacher allowing students to volunteer, the very first student he picked, Steph, he actually picked her at random. So he was using a kind of mixed economy, but the second teacher, in a story, was being much more disciplined. He looks disciplined. He has a sneaky habit of dealing off the bottom of the deck. Yeah. So he looks like he's going through it systematically, but sometimes he actually shuffles, or sometimes he actually just rigs things just to keep just mix things up. And I thought the other interesting thing was he did pick Christian at random, but then he said, "Tell me why you disagreed with so and so." So he'd been actually very carefully monitoring what the students were talking about as he went round. So when he was circling, he was collecting evidence about what the students were doing to inform his subsequent discussion. So he was able to say much more sharply, "Tell me why you disagreed with Rihanna or whatever," and you gave it a 6. So I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? The first teacher did very much focus on the A and the A star, whereas the second teacher was taking a piece of work that was much more modest in achievement. But his conversation was all around what feedback would you give to this student to get it from the B/B borderline up to the A/A star borderline. So I think you're right. There's certainly a difference in the starting point. But I think both of those teachers were pushing towards a very similar thing, which is the highest levels of achievement. Right, I think that second point is very important. I think teachers often rush to self-assessment too quickly, not recognizing how emotionally charged and painful it is for students. This is why that's why students won't reread their work. We always say to students, check your work before they hand it, and they don't do it because they just don't want to know. They just want to get rid of it, because it's just emotionally painful. So in the work we've done with teachers, I think we've become fairly convinced that the correct stepping stones towards self-assessment are assessment of anonymous peers, assessment of actual peers, and then self-assessment. So I thought what that second teacher did was quite skillful in that he was taking an emotionally much less charged piece. You don't know who the student is. This is a piece of coursework that has been done by a complete student that you don't know, that's been assessed by some German teachers, and they've given it a grade. What would you give it? But I think the wrinkle that teacher came up with, what feedback would you give to this student, was a very good way of focusing students on how to improve a piece of work. One thing that you can often do, this works really well in discursive subjects like history, is to give kids 4 pieces of work and ask them to put in rank order of quality. And a really thing to watch out for, make sure the best piece of work is not the longest. Because otherwise the kids might think the long is good. So if you have one piece that's repetitive and goes round and round, but there's a lot of writing, it's quite good to make that a better, more concise piece of work. The most important takeaway from both of those things is both of those teachers took time away from time they could have been teaching stuff to make sure that students understand the criteria for quality. I think most people agree that the second example was probably a bit more sophisticated, but it was about 4 or 5 times longer. So there's a cost-benefit trade-off there. So I don't know which I prefer, actually. The first one seems pretty good to me, given that it was a very quick thing. And it wasn't just giving the kids, here's A star, here's A, here's B, here's C. The teacher said, which of these is which? And it was a bit like the thing I mentioned yesterday, make feedback into detective work. Giving them a concrete puzzle to solve creates that engagement in a way that just saying, read these criteria, doesn't. So for me, the term learning intention is the most general possible term. It's that you intend some learning to take place, and here's the intention. Success criteria are much more concrete, operational. We'll know we've been successful when the following things happen. Right. Now, why do I think it's useful to separate success criteria from learning intentions? Well, there's a strange paradox at the heart of teaching. When I teach students something, I actually don't care if they can do what I've taught them to do. Sounds odd, but it's actually true. If I teach students how to add these 2 fractions, I don't care about those 2 fractions anymore. Of course they can add those 2 fractions. I've shown them how to do it. I care they can add 2 different fractions. If I teach students how to punctuate this sentence, I don't care about that sentence anymore. Of course they can punctuate that sentence. I care they can punctuate a different sentence. Actually, what I really like is they can punctuate when they're writing a ghost story as opposed to doing a punctuation exercise. So here's the important insight here. The only good learning is that which is generalizable. If all students can do is what you taught them to do, they can't do anything. Because those exact circumstances will never arise again. The problem, the bedevil's education, is that our brains don't generalize. It's called the problem of transfer in psychology. This idea came to prominence in the 1970s when researchers like Jean Lave and Barbara Rogoff discovered that adults could do certain mathematics calculations in a supermarket that they couldn't do in a maths classroom. You can do things in some contexts you can't do in other contexts. Scuba divers who are taught things underwater recall them better underwater than they do back at the surface. This never made any sense to me. I once taught the same class maths and science. And one day, I think it was a Thursday, I had them in consecutive periods. So I was doing equations and graphs in the maths classroom, and then the bell went, and we all walked down to the science lab, and I did the same thing in science, and they couldn't remember any of it. They couldn't actually apply it. Because, my science graph had P and V. and the maths graph had X and Y. And they thought they were completely different topics. So the point is, we don't make those connections naturally because our brains tie the context of the learning to the learning. And good teaching requires breaking that link between the context and the learning. And this is what Graham Nuttall, the New Zealand researcher, showed very clearly in his work. When you actually get students to apply something in 3 or 4 different contexts, then you begin to break the link between the context and the learning, and then the learning becomes available more generally. So rather than saying, you know, we are learning to construct arguments for and against assisted suicide, no, the purpose of this is we are learning to construct arguments for and against emotionally charged propositions. The context of the learning is assisted suicide, but the success criterion is, can we apply this to a different context, like the death penalty or abortion? Use posters of keywords to talk about learning. Now, maths and science in particular have this habit of taking perfectly good English words and giving them special meanings. Sometimes the words are still in use in English in a vernacular sense and in a special sense in science or maths. So describe and explain are very similar in meaning in ordinary language, but in science they're completely different. You know, if you've got a graph of the reactivity of an enzyme with temperature, as a description, it goes up and then it goes down, because that is what the graph does, but that's not an explanation. We ask students, are these two triangles similar? And many students go, yeah, kinda. They don't realize they've asked a specific mathematical question. So I think the really important point here is when we do use these terms, you know, being successful requires knowing that there's a special use at this point. In English, we often give kids planning frames or writing frames, and I think it's a good idea. You level the playing field when you tell students about canonical structures, the structures that come up all the time. So a nice example of this, a teacher was working on suspense stories. So they read some suspense stories as a class, and then the class discussed what made a good suspense story, and the class eventually came to a consensus that a good suspense story had at least 4 phases, establishing the characters, a period of rising tension, a climax, and a resolution. So the kids then set to writing their suspense stories. It's really important to recognize that any structure we give our kids is both a constraint and a support. They will often help the weaker students to do better work because they're getting the access to the code. But it can become a straitjacket. And that's why what this teacher did next was so smart. I was really impressed. It was a lovely idea. So these kids had written they wrote their suspense stories using the standard structure. And then she showed them the beginning of a clip from a TV show called NCIS. I don't know if you've watched that. So, and this is becoming quite a common trope in TV dramas now. The beginning of the episode, the hero is in an action sequence and gets into a spot of bother, and the action freezes, and then comes up the caption, 6 hours earlier. And that's becoming quite a common kind of way of creating some novelty. What the teacher just pointed out to the students was what this director is doing is messing with the structure. They're starting with the climax and then filling in the other bits. So then the teacher said to the students, write a suspense story where you do not follow the standard structure. So I thought it was a lovely example of acknowledging the value of the structure, but also introducing a sense of playfulness, where let's break the rules as well. Let's see, and actually, it turns out to be quite hard to do that in a quite sensible way, but it was just a nice example of saying, yes, the structure is there, but it's not a straitjacket, and if you want to break the rules, that's allowed if you think you know what you're doing. So using planning and writing frames judiciously. And then using annotated examples of different standards to flesh out rubrics. So there's no doubt, the research is pretty clear here, if you want students to understand quality, examples of quality are more effective than descriptions of quality. So I think that for me is why that second example of the videos we saw is more sophisticated than the first. Descriptions of quality often don't mean to novices what they mean to experts. So I don't know if you heard PRIN, the the girl at the front of the classroom, she's talking about sustained and concise, which is actually in the grade descriptions. One student in the class, I remember, she said she was confused. I said, what's the problem? She said, well, it says to get A star, I have to be sustained and concise. And I said, yes, so what's the problem? She said, well, I can't see how I can be both, because sustained means long and concise means short. Now the point is, to the subject expert, those are terms of art, and there's no conflict. But the words did not mean to the novice what they meant to the expert. And that happens all the time. Words are not mirrors. Words do not reflect the world. They're inadequate to reflect the world. And so the crucial thing is, examples are often far more effective. If you can then create a sense of understanding, some teachers call this process co-construction. Have you come across that phrase? You co-construct the success criteria or the rubric with the students. I have no problem with that term. I have no problem with the process, provided the negotiations are rigged. And the students do not get to decide what counts as quality writing. I think you, in your classroom, are there representing a discipline. And it is an abdication of your responsibility to let the students decide what counts as good work in this subject. You have a special role as an ambassador for that discipline. And I have no problem with the process of co-construction as a way of taking the students with you, but you have to end up with success criteria that faithfully represent the norms of your discipline. Not too often is left out. And finally, it's been shown that preparing for a test can be very effectively done by practice tests. But what's interesting is the best way to prepare a test is to ask students to prepare test questions with correct solutions about what they've been studying. It requires a far deeper engagement in the content. So you ask, if you've been doing a unit on pulleys and levers, for example, get students to write 2 or 3 questions with correct solutions about what they've been learning. It forces students to think about what the big ideas are, causes a much deeper engagement than answering somebody else's questions about the same content.